Hi, everyone. Welcome to another exciting edition of Words, Images, and Worlds. On this episode, I'm delighted to be talking with someone who is well versed in the world of animation and someone whose creations have lived around for some time, and that is director, producer, creator Tad Stones. May I call you Tad? Is that okay?
You certainly may.
Well, thank you so
People
much.
have done that all my life. And I went to Disney, and Disney, you're not allowed to use last names. So,
There you go. There you go. Well, glad to have you on the podcast and glad to be talking about, of course, Darkwing Duck is something you've been talking about a lot
yeah,
recently. Is that right?
that is correct. Dynamite Comics did a Kickstarter to collect all the books they've done in the last year, and even some of his early stuff, some of which I had not known about. So that's a
Hmm.
lot of fun. So yeah, I did a lot of interviews for those guys.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I was, of course, excited to see Dynamite pull back the world of Darkwing Duck and release their series, and have read several issues of that and enjoyed it a great deal because, of course, I am a fan of the original show as well.
Cool. Yeah, I
Yeah.
was excited not only to see Darkwing, but I assumed they were just going to do a Darkwing series and then see how it went.
Hmm.
But instead, they went ahead and launched two spinoffs, Negaduck and Justice Ducks. They each have a different kind of a feeling, and I just think it's great.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. Now, you've also worked in worlds like Hellboy. You mentioned Disney. Hellboy wouldn't fit quite into Disney, but Aladdin
Hey, I
being one of
did I
those.
did pitch Hellboy at Disney at one point
Oh,
as kind
nice,
of an
nice.
animated X Files, but it's just as well that it didn't go.
Yeah,
So
yeah.
it would have
They're
been
doing
Heck
Deadpool.
Boy. See a you see a big giant Hellboy on Main Street of Disneyland. It would be strange, but yeah, I did the two Hellboy films, and in fact, just this weekend they opened up a gallery show celebrating Hellboy's 30th, and I was proud to be a part of that.
Wow.
So
Lots
yeah,
of full circle moments. It's been a busy
oh
couple of
exactly.
weeks.
Yeah, this is my Darkwing wall. That's my
Uh,
Hellboy wall. So
nice, nice. You are surrounded by lots of creating. I love it.
oh yeah.
Yeah. Well, of course, I'm curious about what led you to animation and what led you to these very comic bookian. I'm not sure if that's a word. I think that's a word, comic bookian worlds.
Um, well, starting with comics, when I was a little kid, I started reading comics. I'm sure I looked at pictures before I could read the words, but starting out with the Disney comics, and you're talking the 50s. I was born in 1952. Um, and it was I remember Hot Stuff,
Mhm,
which was
mhm.
the little devil character at Harvey Comics, and Spooky. Those two were my favorite more than Casper and Wendy and Dot. And I was never into Richie Rich, but that's how I started. And then I quickly moved into superhero stuff because they were just everywhere.
Mhm.
Um, the pardon me there. Back then, there were no comic shops. There were spinner racks, and they were in supermarkets and pharmacies and anywhere that there might be a magazine. There was comics there, um, and including the barber shop, which was great because you went in every couple of weeks back then to get your hair trimmed, and there was always a stack of ratty comics.
Mhm. Mhm.
Plus, when I started collecting, we had used bookshops, and every used bookshops would have like a big box of old comics. And I remember I got two copies of Avengers #1 for a nickel each,
Wow.
and
Wow.
even adjusted for inflation, that was a deal. Um, so yeah, I just love the world of comics. My dad had wanted to be a newspaper comic artist, like an editorial cartoonist, but he came out of school right in the depression, and it was more about finding a job to put food on the table. Um, and I guess he was never the guy to work a long day and then although I've got pictures of him at his drawing board doing this, I guess I shouldn't say that, but especially when he started having a family, he couldn't. He wasn't so dedicated. They would have locked the door and said, "Don't bother me,"
Mhm.
as he worked
Mhm.
on cartoons. But I had all these not just art books all around the house, but there were cartooning books. In fact, the famous artist cartooning course with like Milt Caniff, Al Cap, Willard Mullins. You know, a lot of the things I learned in those books, I helped me get into Disney in the first place. So anyway, aside from comics and that atmosphere and that comics were permitted, no one ever said, "Why are you reading it? I'm not going to buy you that anymore."
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, that was, you know, that was a huge sin for me. The other thing is my dad brought home, because he was in marketing, they would do campaigns where they had stationery. Well, when the campaign was over, he brought home reams of that stationery because the back was pure white. They'd have some sort of logo of Little Frisky's dog food or something on the front, but on the back. So I had this never-ending supply of drawing paper, which was, again, just having the material around was huge. And
Yeah.
then I love cartoons. And again, when I was a kid, not only were it just cartoons, every once in a while, Walt would take us behind the scenes in the Disneyland show and to promote some animated film, or a couple of episodes on the secrets of animation. Walter Lantz did a Woody Woodpecker show where he showed how to draw Woody Woodpecker and all that. So
Hmm. Hmm.
I was just sucking all that stuff in. And I love cartoons. I always loved seeing it. And my dad worked for Carnation Company, and they had a deal with Disneyland. So they had a restaurant on Main Street, and the company picnic was there once a year. So that was fantastic. We actually got to go to Disneyland once a year. And when I was there, they had an art of animation exhibit. And my dad bought the Art of Animation book by Bob Thomas, which is a classic.
Hmm.
And it shows all the steps to making an animated film based on Sleeping Beauty, um, just all the way through. And many of the guys in those pictures I ended up working with years later. So my love of cartooning and animation was always there. And I was just very lucky that when I went to college, the sweet mate of my girlfriend was the daughter of a famous animator, Exitencio, or I should say animator, a layout man and designer, and then went on to design rides at Disneyland, like Pirates of the
Oh,
Caribbean. Anyway, she knew about this training program. Otherwise, I never would have heard about it. I just kind of given up on animation because I thought Disney had all their guys, which was true probably through my high school years. And then they started it up, and you know, early on, I wasn't in the first wave, but very 1974 was still. I think they started it in 71 or something, but I survived the training program. Was basically Eric Larson, who was one of Disney's great animators. And then there was the review board would look at portfolios to see if you even got into that. And then you'd have 4 weeks to do an animated test. And then if you survived that, you had another 4 weeks to do a second test. And if you survived that, you went into, most people anyway, went into in-betweening, which I was terrible at, was almost fired over. Um, anyway, that got me into Disney, and that girlfriend is now my wife. So that worked out too.
wonderful, wonderful. Glad to hear that as well. Yeah. Full circle, truly full circle.
Yeah.
Yeah. Uh, I'm always interested in hearing about process. So I know you've worked as both a producer and director. Uh, what were both of those experiences like? And I know you've directed extensively on Darkwing Duck in particular. So curious
Well, it
to hear
was
about
like,
that.
it's, I still had directors, episode directors. So I'm credited in some places as directors. I think really my credits would be producer, story editor, and then I wrote some scripts. So I'm not sure that I have correct director credits. Also, there's a mix up that timing directors are people who basically animate without drawing much, or they just do little figures. They have to look at the storyboard, figure out the breakdown in action, and put it on an exposure sheet to say, in this, and they do a little stick figure, and anticipate the jump. So there'd be a little antic for 6 frames, and then leap at the top of the arc is going to be 3 frames. This is going to be, or you know, I'm not giving you real timing here because that'd be a real quick jump.
Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
anyway, they kind of have to, it's like animated by remote control. So they're called timing directors, and often you'll see that come up as directors of episodes. But my directors on the show were my producing partner, Alan Zaslov, Toby Shelton, who was also did the character designs of all the lead characters, and Russ Mooney. Am I getting Russ's last name right? I think so. And that went on for 90 episodes, and maybe some people cycled in the second season or something like that. You know, it's 30 years ago or whatever, so
Yes,
I don't
yeah.
get every name right.
I was going to ask, you might have answered this elsewhere, but that spark moment where Darkwing Duck sort of came along, any memories of that as far as the way he came into form?
Yeah, I mean, I was told to create a show called Double O Duck by Jeffrey Katzenberg, and I tried doing it as just a straight spy parody, and that failed. And Jeffrey pointed out it needed Disney heart. It's You don't want a simple parody; it has to stand on its own. And we had had an episode of DuckTales that starred Launchpad McQuack, and he specifically said it's about create a new character to be Double O Duck. Launchpad can be in the show, but that was it. Anyway, as far as creative sparks, I then had to take it seriously, which of course I should have done the first time around. But we had generated artwork that showed him. We came up with the idea that would really give it heart, which was giving him a daughter to raise, who you could barely contain. So that really sealed the show. As then there was yes, yes, now you're on the right track. So after that, it was kind of like the details. Um, we had generated art that was a generic Donald Duck type duck in a white tuxedo, and then wearing I think it was a blue mask and hat and a cape, and just a modest fedora. Um, anyway, one of the story editors that I was going to use, because I was able to bring in people on staff to just brainstorm stuff. Dwayne Capizzi actually said that outfit looks less like a spy and more like Green Hornet or he said the pulp heroes like the Green Hornet or the Shadow. And that was a real spark moment because not necessarily a direct line to Darkwing Duck, but away from the James Bond stuff. It's like that gives us a different template. And I remembered reading about Doc Savage, who had a team of experts, like an electrical engineer, chemical engineer, communications guy, whatever. However, they were very much eccentric. So, like one of those engineers looked like an ape, and the other guy that he was constantly squabbling with was this prim, skinny Englishman. And it's like they're always squabbling, but they, put down their lives for each other type thing. So we played around with that, came up with a lot of characters, but eventually it was just too many characters. We kept paring it down because a lot of those characters would have been at headquarters, which means you'd never get to your mission. So we kept the spy stuff, which gave us an excuse to put shows set around the world. The idea that, oh, there's trouble in Zanzibar. We have to you have to look into it. But along the way, it was pitched and successful as Double O Ducks. They took out big double page spreads in Variety, but it turns out, oh, Double O Duck is not, or excuse me, Double O is not public domain. It is not just a satirical thing. It is owned by Ian Fleming family, who created James Bond, and currently in possession of the people producing the James Bond movies. And they were not happy to see this major campaign push using the word double O, and obviously going to be a comedy because they were trying to reinvigorate the Bond line at the time. So we had to do a name change. We did a contest. There were just every alliterative idea that you could think of: Dangerous Duck, Dudley Duck, Deadeye Duck. And finally, Alan Burnett, who then went on to work on the animated Batman, he won with the name Darkwing. And it wasn't like that was the best of the 5 finalists. It was like, no, that name and a bunch of trash, nothing even worth considering. And I said, that's great. That's what the character thinks of himself as, a really cool name like that. And I said, let's put Duck with it because that makes it sillier, which is more of like what he really is. So that's how the inspiration hit. And, at that point, I gave myself permission, maybe not consciously, but I just veered into Silver Age comics,
Mhm.
which was hardly any continuity other than the basic stuff of, yes, Jimmy Olsen is Superman's pal, and Lois Lane suspects Clark Kent is Superman, and there's green kryptonite, red kryptonite, and Lex Luthor hates him because there was an explosion in his lab when he was a teenager and he lost all his hair. And
Yeah.
thus
Yeah.
began a life of crime because he lost his hair. Um, Only someone had given him a toupee.
Right,
Uh,
right.
anyway, the stories were silly. The covers were outrageous. You're talking, here's this cub reporter. What's a natural story for a cub reporter? Oh, he gets turned into a 40-foot turtle man, or he gets elastic powers, or Lois becomes super evolved and has a giant head. A story which they redid with many of their characters, and a lot of half remembered covers from The Flash stuck with me,
Yeah.
um, because he was turned into a marionette. He was made fat. He was made old. He went into another universe, starting the whole uh, alternate universe idea. And, that stuff, I couldn't look it up on the internet. Internet was just text based at the time. I couldn't pull up a bunch of covers to pin up on the walls for inspiration, but it was better to be half remembered in my head, because then I would have been self conscious about swiping ideas or anything. Whereas I knew the generic stuff. Like, we never had a speedster really, that I remember. Certainly not as a hero, but every cartoon, every comic company had somebody who was strong, could fly, usually both, or they could stretch, or, and same with villains. There were plant villains all over, and, there's Poison Ivy, there was Plant Man, there was the Floronic Man, there was Swamp Thing, so Bushroot fit right into that
Oh,
category.
yes. Yeah. Yeah. Well, you mentioned Dynamite sort of taking the character on and doing all of these interesting expanding universe kind of approaches. What would you like to see them do next?
One of my favorite in fact, probably my favorite of the three is the Justice Ducks comic,
Hmm.
which is by Roger Langridge. And Roger is one of the funniest men in comics, and doing comedy in a comic book form is not easy. Um, but it comes closest to what I remember those old Donald Duck, Uncle Scrooge comics being, in the Carl Barks stuff, in that he gets into the adventure really quick. Most of the ones that I've read so far, anyway, are standalone adventures. In one comic, you get the whole adventure. Um, and Jeff Parker did a great job on Negaduck. Amanda Dibert did the whole Darkwing series, and she really nailed Morgana Macabre. And the fact that she did so well on Morgana, who was our supernatural hero villain,
Yeah.
um, I would love to see them do a 6 issue limited series on each of the Justice Duck's characters, except for
Yeah.
Darkwing, since he has his own series. But to really let each one have a completely different type of adventure. So Morgana would have a supernatural adventure, and pull from comic books from the last 30 years, in that
Yeah.
we played with Universal monsters, a little bit of H.P. Lovecraft. It's like she could pull from, Neil Gaiman's Sandman, having the Endless, or Doctor Strange with Steve Ditko's bizarre worlds that he designed.
Hmm.
Um, all the new things that come up in Doctor Fate and all that. Not doing a direct parody, but looking at any of those things. Like, here's this cute character of death in the Sandman. It's like, what's the duck version of that, and what's the twist? We can't just do the same thing, but she's a duck. How would that weave into a story? I think that would just be, I would love to just brainstorm on that story with it. And then our aquatic character, Neptunia, which Roger was real smart. Her personality was always super strong and belligerent. That made her naturally take the leadership role in the Justice Ducks, which solved
Hmm.
the problem of, what do you do with an aquatic character when there's no ocean around? Um, anyway, she could have a whole undersea adventure with new adversaries, or it could be, take the idea of a ghost pirate ship and Davy Jones, and that could be part of her adventure. So again, something that's really different from the other one.
Hmm.
And Gizmo Duck could pull from obviously not just Iron Man, but from Superman, because Gizmo Duck is very much the Superman icon of the city loves him. He gets the key to the city. He's seen as being a hero. He has a secret identity. You know, you could play with all that kind of stuff in his story. And Stegmutt is just this innocent character, this giant dinosaur who is so oblivious to what's going on around him. I think that would be the broadest comedy of them all, and how he's ends up saving the day without actually realizing it. So
Yeah.
that's what I'd like to see. You know, as doing all these interviews, that one kept popping up.
Love it. Love it. Yeah. Yeah. Well, of course, I'd like to ask about where people can find out what's next for you and more about the books with Dynamite. I do have a Hellboy question, if that's okay.
Sure, that's
So,
fine.
yeah, not a character that you would necessarily immediately transplant to animation, although there's been a really cool history of sort of more adult oriented or teen oriented work being transplanted. So I'm curious what it was like to take that world of Mike Mignola and bring it into animated form.
Well, I loved his comics and still do, and just the way of his storytelling and all that. And that we weren't necessarily making it for kids. I just told what I thought was like core Mike Mignola kind of stuff, and that was the. I mean, that Darkwing and Hellboy were my two favorite things in my career. Um, Doing the Hellboy stuff was the idea of actually writing. I wrote it like it was a live action film, basically. Well, I mean, I'm too much of an animator to do it literally, but just saying if you're going into a haunted place, you don't telegraph it ahead of time. You let the people discover how scary it is as the characters are discovering. And we did that in the second one. I think they go into this, very nice house, and then they split up to search, and each of the team has this very, scary experience. And some of them, it's like that is a great image that if they did it in a live action film, it would work just as well.
Yeah,
So to me, it wasn't a challenge. It was something. Oh, I finally get to do this,
nice,
um,
nice.
and it worked out. We were actually the first one really was about the short stories that Hellboy did, or excuse me, Mike Mignola did early on in Hellboy's stories. It wasn't just these long stories, multi-part stories. There were a lot of little short stories. And
Mhm.
so we got to, for those of us who actually bought the comics as they were coming out, we were introduced to Hellboy at a slightly different way. Instead of this, it was this continuing story. And every once in a while, we got these shorter stories that really, a lot of times, showcased more humor in Hellboy than you might get in the other ones. Um, so now, if you're going to read Hellboy, you would go through and buy the various trade paperback collections, and which is still great, but it's a slightly different experience. So, we actually did a couple of short subjects that are included on the DVDs of that. So that was super fun. The first one was about the short stories, as I said. The second one was about basically Hellboy's family in a way, in that it's about vampires and Central Europe and werewolves and that kind of classic stuff. And then the third one, which we wrote, was the mad scientists and Nazis side of Hellboy, which was even, you know, there were cybernetic apes and heads floating in jars, and um, it was, and Lobster Johnson was going to show
Yes.
up in that one. So that one was written as a script, but never, while what we had written that script, they said, okay, we're not ready to do the third one yet. We have this other project we want you to do, which was Turok, Son of Stone,
Hmm. Hmm.
which is the most violent thing I've ever done, because it was somebody else's script. And at first they wondered, oh, is that, look at this guy's resume. Can he do this? And they said, well, he did Hellboy. Yeah, but still. And we did it literally as it was written and
Hmm.
showed some stuff. And the client went, "Oh God, you can't do that." It's like, okay, then don't put it in the script, you know. So that they weren't worried about me going too far after that. Anyway, sadly, after we finished that, they had sold the company to Stars Media. Stars was interested in doing funding animated projects on their own. In fact, we kind of got the feeling that Stars bought the company for the video library that they had. They had all
Uh,
sorts of films, and Stars, obviously, like any other streaming place, just needs content. Uh, and they were kind of surprised that there was an animation side to things. But luckily, it's where The Simpsons are done, not the writing part of it and all that, but the actual production of The Simpsons was being done by that company. So it was like, oh, well, we've heard about that.
mhm,
you
mhm.
know, obviously, yeah. I think that helped keep things going there. But when I came to the end of my contract, since there was no other Hellboy movie, then I was out and on to other things.
Well, really appreciate your work in that world and in the Darkwing world. And of course, that final question is, what's next for you? Probably many other podcasts to talk about Darkwing Duck and
No, actually,
appearances.
the Kickstarter is over, so it slowed down. But there are a couple of guys who now said, "Hey, I'd like to talk to you," and it's like they were kind of unaware of the Kickstarter, which
Hmm.
was a
Hmm.
success. But I'm going to say, "Well, here's somebody who should have heard about it." So, guess they didn't reach out far enough.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
so, really, the other thing that I did a ton of before the pandemic was going to cons.
Hmm.
In that
Hmm.
I don't have a merchandise to sell. If a con invites me as a guest, it's no cost to me because I'm a guest. They're flying me there and giving me a room and whatever. And I end up having to do a lot of original art so that there's something for fans to buy. So I'm not just sitting at the table saying, "Hey, come talk to me."
Right, right.
Um, Although that's most of the time I'm doing. Uh, so after the pandemic, that just I mean, it got me some world travel. My last con was in Russia. There was one in the Netherlands. I was supposed to do one in England, literally when transportation was shut down. Uh, and now I'm kind of dipping my toe in to say, "Hey, are you interested in having me?" I contacted a couple of the cons I'd gone to before and didn't hear anything back. Well, finally heard back from one who said, "Nope, sorry, can't take everybody." Um, so I would say look for me at local conventions, and if they're, and the way to get me there is contact a local convention and say, "Hey, here's a guy I'd like to see." So that's
Mhm.
kind of been my ulterior motive in all the Kickstarter podcasts I did. It's like, "Hey, you want me? I'm happy to
Absolutely.
come because it gets me out of the house." Because this office is very
Absolutely.
small. This office is basically as far that way as you're seeing here. So
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
Well, if I'm a listener that wants to get in touch with you, websites, social media spaces,
I'm sorry,
anything. Oh,
you're
sorry.
freezing up right there.
If I'm a listener who wants to get in touch with you, any web spaces, social media spaces, anything like that that you'd like to mention?
Um, on social media, I got off of Twitter. The uh, so I'm only on Blue Sky, which is frankly a great place, and I just basically follow writers and artists there, and it's like a calming influence. I'm on
Hmm.
Facebook because hey, I'm old, and that's still where if I'm going to sell some artwork online, I'll basically be posting it there. And once a year, I usually do a charity thing where I'm doing commissions, and it's a blind auction where you just submit how much you would pay for a given piece of art, and you don't know what's being bid by anybody else, but it all goes to charity. Um, and so, really, those are the only two places. I mean, I have an Instagram account, but there's plenty of old stuff to look at, but I always forget to check it, and I, rarely remember to post any stuff there. So I'm not completely invisible, but yeah, I'd say maybe Instagram, Facebook, definitely I check every day, and Blue Sky I check every day.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, Tad, thank you for the time. Thank you for the creating of the
My pleasure.
conversation. Glad to have you back at any point.